Friends, how lovely to see you again. James, very nice to see you too.
Very good to see you too, Ian.
Now, when we broadcast is not the same time as when we record. So I probably shouldn't say it was really nice to see you all day yesterday, because that will throw our viewers off.
Indeed. But in fact, yesterday was not Sunday. So,
no, it wasn't. Not for us.
No.
We could do a bit of philosophy about time and what would it mean for God to be outside time, and
we could. Yeah. I don't think it'd illuminate the passage very much, though, somehow.
It won't. Well, having mentioned that, we better actually dive straight in and remind our viewers of what the passage is.
Yeah, it's Mark 8, 27 to 38 for Trinity 16. And this is, if there's a deja vu feeling going on amongst our viewers, then that's not at all surprising, because we used part of this passage in Lent 2 in just earlier on in the year, and we did a video on this, Mark 8, 31 to 38. So the second part of it, as it were, was something we talked about on that video. Yeah.
And people may be feeling that they've heard the word deja vu before as well.
Boom. Oh dear, it's one of those days.
It is. And the problem with the French, of course, is they don't have a phrase for deja vu. But anyway.
That's right, classic. Thank you very
much. So, but with the levity, we probably ought to remind our loyal viewers what they ought to be doing as well.
Yeah, it'd be lovely if you would click like on the videos. That helps. Do subscribe to the channel.
Yes, subscribe button.
You'll get a notification of the next video. Do share on your socials.
Yeah, on all your socials.
And do comment wherever you find it. Yeah,
very nice. Yes,
lovely.
And things get known by word of mouth. So do
chat about them, and just say if you've got colleagues who are preaching or whatever, and they think they might find this helpful, do tell them.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've talked about the fact we're in Mark 8. Now, we ought to locate that, of course, in the context of the lectionary and in context of the other Gospels. I've noticed that there's one thing, a couple of things that were quite interesting about it. I'm reaching back here for my Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels, which my camera settings might not show up very well.
No, it's showing okay. Yeah, well, I can see it.
Yeah. And it's just one of these really interesting things. We quite often notice that when there are parallel passages in Mark and Matthew and Luke, often Mark has the longer one. But actually, this is an example where Mark is shorter. And again, if I just sort of, you've got the introduction of the passage on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side there, you can see that.
Yeah.
I'm a bit out of focus. But there's a whole section here in Matthew, which where Jesus responds to Simon Peter. Lest you Simon Bar Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, and then stuff about the I will build this rock and I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven and so on. Now, I can't remember whether we've explored that in the video, but I've certainly read about it before on the blog. And because of that, the lectionary actually divides this section into 2 readings in Matthew, whereas we've got the shorter one in Mark.
Yeah.
I suppose the main benefit of this is just reminding ourselves yet again that the gospel writers are highly selective.
Yeah.
So, there's lots of other things Jesus said, and there's lots of things in this episode that Jesus says, according to Matthew, which Mark hasn't included.
Yeah.
So we do need to recognize that we are hearing the words of Jesus through the words of the gospel writer.
Yes. And the gospel writer's intent is that we should understand Jesus, and they go about that, helping us to understand him in slightly different ways, as you would expect of any 4 individual writers. So it's not at all surprising, but that is what's going on. Yeah.
And again, we might, in our scientific age, feel a tension between what is true on the one hand and a word-for-word recording of Jesus's words. And of course, that's a tension which actually need not have purchase, because as you said, I mean, the gospel writers are seeking to communicate who Jesus is, and they do that by selecting parts of his teaching and some of his words and recording them. So that, I mean, obviously it's put most explicit at the end of John's gospel, the fourth gospel, where he says, if the whole world couldn't hold all the books, but these things I've written so that you might believe. So this is recording the truth about Jesus with a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something else which is really fascinating about this passage, and that is its location within the Gospel of Mark, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's right bang in the middle of Mark. It's the pivotal moment in
Mm,
Mark. Long been understood that this is the point at which Jesus' ministry changes. He
mm,
sets his face to Jerusalem. Essentially, he's
mm,
on his way to Jerusalem after this,
mm.
um, and that's indicated in the text. Actually, even in this text today, actually. Um, but where he uses Mark uses the phrase "on the way."
Oh, yes.
On the way he asked his disciples. Now, this phrase "on the way"
Yeah.
occurs 9 times, I think, in chapters 8 to 12, on the way to Jerusalem, and it's
Wow.
indicative of this
Yeah.
movement.
Yeah.
So that's it's definitely a really pivotal moment, an important moment.
That's fascinating that phrase occurs. I hadn't realized that before, but
Mm.
that's we notice that the only time in the fourth gospel where we use the language of being on the way or walking with Jesus is in that in chapter 6 after the feeding of the 5,000.
Yes.
But we have in the past noticed that this is a dominant idea in Luke. The middle of Luke's gospel is all on a
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah.
So this is a sort of metaphor for discipleship. But it is fascinating, isn't it, that Mark also picks up that idea as well.
Yeah. And of course, up to this point, as we've remarked on previous weeks, Jesus is crisscrossing the lake kind of
Yep.
endlessly, and that carries on in the earlier part of chapter 8.
Yep.
He's going from Dalmanutha, which is near Magdala, across to the eastern side of the Jordan to Bethsaida,
Yeah.
and so on. And so it's, but now, once we get to sort of the location of this incident in Caesarea Philippi, after
Mm.
that, we're on our way to
Yeah.
Jerusalem, essentially. Yeah.
Now, another little thing to note then about the way that the gospel writers have written their gospels. So Matthew follows Mark particularly in having this sort of crucial moment halfway through the gospel,
Yes.
and that Jesus' ministry changes shape and changes location. So for
Yeah.
both Matthew and Mark, the first half of Jesus' ministry is in Galilee. And particularly in Mark, it is marked by, if I can use that phrase, it's marked by dynamic miracles. Yes, opposition coming from Jerusalem, but primarily the crowds following and people spreading the word about him. And also distinctively in Mark, this sort of the secrecy motif where he tells people not to tell others because otherwise he won't be able to cope with the crowds.
Yeah.
And then the second half, a very different feel to it,
Yeah.
both in Matthew and in Mark.
Yes.
And I think for me, again, that's a reminder that although people have often thought of the synoptics as the historical gospels and John as the spiritual one, in fact, in this regard, John is much more realistic. Jesus, as an Orthodox Jew, would have been going to Jerusalem 3 times a year, every year in his ministry.
Yeah.
And of course, all of that, none of that happens in Mark and Matthew. And they make this artificial division of Jesus' ministry into 2 phases.
Yes. That's very interesting, isn't it? I think it's also worth noting that that John doesn't have this moment,
Yes.
but he does have a pivotal moment, which I think we've also done a video about quite recently, which is, of course, when the Greeks come
Yes, in chapter 12.
so we would see Jesus, and this is indicative of them, and becomes the moment at which Jesus essentially sets his face towards the cross. So it's
absolutely. And in chapter 11, with Lazarus, when raising of Lazarus, that's what provokes the authorities to return.
Exactly. So you get that. Yeah.
But it seems to me that Mark and Matthew are particularly saying, look, they're describing 2 phases of Jesus' ministry.
Yeah.
And I would say that's indicating 2 aspects
Yes.
of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So there are times when our lives as disciples look like the amazing stuff, the crowds, the people coming and so on. But there are also other times or aspects of our life where our discipleship looks like that costly carrying the cross and walking with Jesus to rejection and vulnerability.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's other, I mean, we might explore this as we get through into the passage, but I think there's other aspects of it as well that, in the first part of the gospel, the disciples frequently don't understand the parables and they have to have them explained privately.
Yeah.
After this point, there aren't any parables of that nature, I don't think. And the disciples ask, if you like, kind of more intelligent questions. They deal with the plain teaching of Jesus, but they ask probing questions because they want to understand, but they do understand what he's talking about, if you see what I mean. So it's a really quite a significant shift in the behavior of the disciples before and after this moment. And I guess that to some degree that reflects our own experience as well. That we or our own experience reflects that. Yeah.
Mm. So let's just go through the passage.
Mm.
You talked about him going on with his disciples to the villages of Syria. You mentioned the fact that we talked about being on the way.
Yes.
Caesarea Philippi is a
Yes.
significant location, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's 25 miles north of Bethsaida. It's the source of the Jordan River. I think we've both been there, seen the Jordan flowing out of the rock.
Yep.
But in the ancient times, it was interesting because it was mainly a Gentile
Yes.
area.
Yes.
It had this a temple dedicated to the god Pan, so it's often called Banias, I think, in modern
Yeah,
Hebrew.
that's right. That gives it a name. Yeah.
And so it's a center of pagan worship. It's not the obvious place where you would expect necessarily
No.
Peter to confess Jesus as the Messiah for the first time. So that's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. One little nugget of information there is it's actually in the territory that's allocated to the tribe Dan.
Yeah.
And the fact that it is as far as possible from Jerusalem, you could go within the boundaries of that definition of biblical Israel.
Yeah.
Dan, the tribe of Dan were fed up with the fact they were so far away from Jerusalem and the idea that you had to go to Jerusalem to worship God. So they actually set up their own high places and worship there.
Yeah.
And they're castigated for that. And in fact, in the book of Revelation, the listing of the 12 tribes in chapter 7 omits Dan, because the thrust of it is that this is the people of God who are disciplined in their worship of God, devoted to him.
Right.
And Dan is seen as a compromiser in that regard.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
So you are, as it were, as far from Jerusalem as you can be. So Jesus has gone all the way as far north, and so this is the turning point in the gospel. This is literally also the turning point for Jesus and his disciples, because having gone north, they now turn and head south.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm also struck, and I don't know if commentators pick this up, but there's another sense here, another example here where Jesus is taking time out away from the crowds.
Yeah.
And it's just really noticeable, and it sits very starkly with the focus on crowds that Mark gives us, that even though the crowds are pursuing him, Jesus is not a slave to the expectations of the crowds.
No.
And he recognizes his own need and the need of his disciples to take time away by themselves.
Yes, and there seems to be a frequent thing that goes on in Mark. So those of us who are at New Wine would have heard Ruth Bushjager, who was speaking about the times that Jesus calls the disciples away through Mark's gospel, and she in 5 days she didn't have enough time to do all of them, but she was incredibly insightful in the ones that she was able to do for us. And it clearly is a very significant aspect, this retreat, as it were, either for rest or recuperation, or for time with God, or for time with his disciples. This seems to be one of those moments.
And that works itself out. I mean, I don't know how popular the idea of going on retreat is, but I know that you and I certainly in our initial ordination training, we were inducted into the need to go and retreat. I used to go on a 3-day every New Year when I was single. I went down to see my parents in Kent for Christmas, and then after that, over New Year, I would spend 3 days in silence in Westmoreling.
Westmoreling, yeah, absolutely. I've been to St Bino's not that long ago, and in North Wales for a week's retreat, which immensely helpful. Yeah, and following the practice of Jesus. Yeah,
indeed. So interesting again here that the next phase is provoked by a question Jesus asks, which is always rather telling, isn't it?
Yeah, and isn't it fascinating? I love the way he does this, because he clearly has. We know what the real question is, but he doesn't begin with the real question.
Okay,
Isn't that interesting? So it's very, very, very telling that he, instead of asking, "Why? Okay, who do you think I am?" He says, "Who do other people say that I am?" And then, and maybe that emboldens them, particularly Peter, to be more honest. I don't know, but there's clearly it's a bit of an easier way in. But also, I think it's a fascinating thing because it highlights the contrast, doesn't it, between what the disciples believe and what the public believe.
Crowds believe. And I suppose, again, just to think about the interplay between John and Mark, where in John 6 we notice that Jesus says to him, "Well, what did you come to see? You came actually because you were hungry," rather than the real question, the real thing that you need to seek here. And so there's a kind of like a teasing dynamic in that as well. I don't think, by the way, that we need to believe in reincarnation when they say, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say one of the prophets. I think they mean that figuratively. It's not,
Well, I mean, to talk about reincarnation would be to introduce an Eastern idea into the biblical text. So that's never going to work, really, is it? I mean, one would need to, But
his second question is interesting as well. It's interesting. The ESV is quite a sort of word-for-word translation of the Greek. But who do you say I am? But actually, the Greek grammar is quite emphatic, isn't it? It says you. Who do you say I am?
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that the NIV, the TNIV I've got here, it sort of expands that in order to bring out the emphasis. But what about you?
Yeah.
Who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
And Peter answers, you are the Christ.
Yes. I mean, is it worth just rehearsing just before we get onto that about John the Baptist and Elijah and where their ideas about them came from? Because I mean, it's quite an odd. Why would the crowd think John the Baptist or Elijah and not,
why would they?
One of the prophets? Yes, exactly. That's the question, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, you've got the answer.
Well, I mean, the reason for Elijah is I think probably associated with the fact that Elijah, he's taken up to heaven. He doesn't die in the traditional way. Yes. There was an expectation that he would return.
Yes.
So that is when you find somebody like Jesus, maybe it's Elijah.
Yeah.
The John the Baptist thing perhaps is a little bit more, but there's that incident earlier on in chapter 6 with Herod, isn't there? Yeah. And Herod has these views about it as well. Or one of the prophets, yeah.
Is there another dynamic going on, particularly with the Elijah thing, which was that Elijah was the one who was supposed to come to prepare the way for Messiah?
Yeah.
And actually, if Jesus is identified with Elijah, he's actually being identified with disappointment. The disappointment that we hear in John the Baptist's disciples asking, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect another? Yeah. In that, clearly Jesus' ministry delivered some of the things they expected from the Messiah, the Christos, the anointed one, which I'm jumping ahead there.
Yeah.
But in other ways, it didn't. So, because, I mean, this is the point at which we ought to sort of say, well, why does Peter say you are the Christ? What does that mean?
Yes.
Because in the Old Testament, the Christos is just the Greek being anointed, which is the Hebrew word Mashiach, the anointed one.
Yeah.
But of course, in the Old Testament, all sorts of people were anointed ones, anointed with oil, symbolic of being anointed by the Spirit of God, to be equipped and empowered by the presence of God. So kings would be anointed.
Yeah.
Prophets might be anointed.
Yeah. Priests
would be anointed. But actually, by the time of the New Testament period, the Second Temple period, a lot of these ideas of anointing have coalesced, haven't they, into the expectation of an anointed leader who would bring about God's rule, who would reform his people, who would reform the temple, and who would kick out the Romans.
Absolutely. So it's kind of become more focused on kingship, really, in ancient understanding, hasn't it? Than any of the others, particularly. But even so, then perhaps this is what's so interesting, is that despite the fact that Jesus is not obviously, but by this point, actually doing those things, nevertheless, Peter recognizes and recognizes that and is willing and to associate that word, Christos, Messiah, with the Jesus who's in front of him. And I do think it's really interesting that this is not a question that Jesus asks the disciples, almost as soon as he's met them. They've been going around with Jesus for months, if not years.
Yes.
And it's at this point that he asks them the question. I wonder if there's anything there for our challenge in evangelism, in mission. People need to see Jesus at work, don't they? In their lives, they need to see the ways of Jesus in order to come to an understanding, in order to then be able to make a decision for him. And that's an interesting question, I think.
Yes, there's a question of patience there. I remember years ago, John Finney, who's a great evangelist, still around,
Yeah,
did research, and in his research, even in a context where people were being invited to make a decision and to become a disciple, it took them on average 4 years to do that.
yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? And
Yeah,
that's
so it is about giving people time and space to explore questions, to
yeah,
make a clear decision.
yeah, and
So,
that says a lot about what the ethos of our churches, our congregations,
yes,
is how we communicate, how
yeah,
we involve people,
yeah,
how we walk alongside people.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether in our preaching it also, so this is getting us slightly away from the text, but
Mm.
it also suggests that in our preaching, we, not every week, but periodically during the year, maybe once or twice a year, we need to be saying to people, have you made a decision?
Yeah.
What about you?
Yes.
People say Jesus is all sorts of things to them. What about you? Who do you say Jesus is?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that
And
would be
actually giving that question.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then, of course, we come to this, what seems like such a bizarre comment where Peter recognizes you are the Christ,
Mm.
and he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
Yeah. What's that all about?
Well, funnily enough, we've just seen an example of that, because in the previous episode,
Yeah.
which is unique to Mark,
Yeah.
he had a blind man, and he spits in his eyes, lays hands on him, and says, "Do you see anything?" He says, "I see men like trees walking," and he
Yeah.
has to heal him again. So this is an example of where Jesus has to lay hands on someone twice to bring healing,
Yeah.
and he has to keep teaching the disciples so that they can actually have their spiritual sight restored. And then he says to him, "Go home and don't even go in the village." In other words, don't tell anyone about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is part of what people call the messianic secret generally in Mark, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, and there are, I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways of understanding this. I mean, one of the sort of traditional ways of understanding it is that if Peter really is recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, as the King, then politically it would be it would be a disaster if everybody thought that. And of course, there's later on, that people want to make Jesus king and John and everything. So there's a sense in which this is Jesus saying these things. Don't tell anyone, because he is in control of his mission, of how he's going about it and what he's going to do, and how he understands it. So he knows he has to get to the cross. And that becomes clear later on in this very same passage, of course. And this is important to make sure it happens.
Yeah. And then he begins to teach them that the Son of Man will suffer many things. Now, we've talked about Son of Man before and the meaning of that.
We have.
Is it worth going over it again, the sort of three senses of the phrase Son of Man?
Yes, it might be, actually. Yeah, it might be straightforward to saying it's, this, well, the first one is just a circumlocution for saying a human being, me.
This particular person. Yeah.
It can be also in Ezekiel. It's particularly used by God to create the distance between the divine and the human.
So the all-powerful, and actually in some Bible versions, God addresses Ezekiel as mere mortal.
Mere mortal, which is and then of course there's perhaps the major one which we've come to understand behind Jesus' use of it, which is in Daniel chapter 7. Where the Son of Man is a human figure who is vindicated through suffering and comes to the throne, the throne of heaven. So, and that seems to be the resonance which Jesus most frequently is alluding to, in order to try and help the disciples understand how he's going about his mission. So it will involve suffering. So it's not at all surprising that he's here talking about suffering, and he's calling himself the Son of Man. Who is going to be vindicated through that.
And I think, obviously, we explored this before when we looked at this passage, but again, you get quite this complex interweaving between glorification on the one hand and suffering on the other. So he's very clear about the need for him to suffer. But then the very next passage is from chapter 9, is the transfiguration. So you have very tightly put together Jesus's transcendence and his divine glory and power on the one hand, and his humility and weakness and suffering on the other. And
Yeah.
it is interesting the way that Mark just weaves these things together. And I guess we would sort of translate that or transform that and say, well, that's about our theology of the incarnation. It was he who was rich beyond all splendor, who
Yeah.
for our sakes became poor. It was the Word who was with God, who was God in the beginning, who has dwelt amongst us,
Yes. Who has
full of
emptied
grace
himself.
and truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've seen his glory.
We've seen his glory. Yeah.
Mm.
And the emphasis of this particular passage, I guess, is that Jesus is sharing this with the disciples, not simply to tell them what he's about to do, but also to call them
Yes.
to follow him in this way of discipleship. So there's no escape for the Christian from this being the pattern of Christian discipleship. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then there is going to be suffering. But of course, the promise and hope is also a vindication.
Yes. Just worth observing a couple of things people sometimes stumble over. Here in Mark, it says, after 3 days, he will rise again. I think it's Matthew who says he will rise again on the third day. Some people say, well, there's a contradiction there. But actually, after 3 days, we just need to remember that in this context, they use inclusive counting. So you count the day something happens is the first day, the day after it happens is the second day, and the day after that is the third day. So, so on the third day and after 3 days actually are the same phrase. We don't need to be stressed about that kind of apparent contradiction. The other thing, which I don't want to spend very much time on, is that he then, calls the crowd to him and says exactly that. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And of course, that is such a startling thing. And in our popular use of it, we talk about, so-and-so's got a cross to carry, as if this is like a habitual carrying of a burden. Whereas, of course, it would have meant simply there's someone on their way to their death. They've given up everything. They're about to die. So it's not about, great Aunt Bessie who keeps phoning me every Friday. It's a bit of a nuisance kind of thing. No apologies to great Aunt Bessie. It's nothing personal. And the other thing is interesting that some critical scholars say, well, this couldn't possibly be historical because there's no way Jesus could have said made up that kind of saying.
Yes, that's weird, isn't it? You kind of decided in advance what Jesus cannot say as a way of judging and making a judgment about the scriptures. And very strange approach, but it's an approach that we do see quite a bit, don't we?
Yeah. But in fact, why couldn't Jesus have coined this strange expression? I mean, they lived in a world where they knew that the Romans crucified rebels.
Yeah.
What's the sort of standard treatment if you resisted Roman power?
Yeah.
If you're, insurrection, if you're in a slave rebellion, then crucifixion is the way that the Romans used to demonstrate their absolute power and their humiliation of those who defy.
And is it worth just pointing out that Jesus calls the crowd here to him to say these things?
Yes.
Peter has been operating up to this point in this passage as something of a spokesperson for the disciples.
Yeah.
So it's not at all odd, really, that Jesus now calls the crowd to him to explain this. And it's particularly perhaps useful just to point out in the back end of verse 33, get behind me, Satan, Jesus rebukes Peter. But then he says, for you, and the you there is plural, of course, in the Greek, isn't it?
Oh, right.
You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things.
Right.
And I wonder, that there's a who is it that's doing that? Well, it's the disciples, essentially, I think, that are setting their minds. Like
and that's an opportunity to remind us as well that get behind me, Satan isn't about get away, Satan. It's about actually get in line behind me.
Get in
because
line
again,
behind
that language of walking behind is discipleship. So Jesus is calling him back into line as a disciple, saying, no, this is the path I must take because it's the path you must take as well.
Yeah.
You've been looking at James Edwards' commentary. There's quite a nice sort of summary quotation in there.
Yes, there is. I thought this is very, very helpful. He's talking about this decision, as it were. He says, faith is a judgment about Jesus and a willingness to act on the judgment in the face of other possible judgments. Indeed, for the disciples at this point in the gospel, faith will necessitate a choice contrary to the prevailing consensus of the crowds and religious leaders. So that's another interesting take, really, on how Jesus gets them to say, well, what does everybody else think? Or what do you think? And actually what you think has got to be different from what the rest of the people think. And in our world today, that's such an important, always has been such an important thing, the distinctiveness of Christian belief against the culture.
And it's almost sort of physically a picture there where in Banyas he's standing there, disciples, and all this array of other gods behind him in the niches and so on. And they've got to make a decision. And then all the other possible alternatives in terms of how you go to Jerusalem. Are you going to go to Jerusalem in power? Are you going to be the one to drive the Romans out? Or are you going to be the one who deals with the real oppressor, which is the oppression of sin of God's people?
Yeah.
And Jesus is going to go on to say in a couple of chapters, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I think it's a really helpful quotation as well, because it illustrates that actually making that faith commitment, making the decision for Jesus, is something that requires courage.
It does. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
James, thank you very much. Great to explore you. Friends, thank you for joining us. And I'll put a link as well to the other discussion of the second half of that passage as well, in case that's useful. Don't forget to click a like. Don't forget to comment. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get future videos. And don't forget to share on your socials and pass it around. So we look forward to seeing you next time. James, see you next week.
Indeed.